today's World Insight with Tian Wei, UN Conference on Climate Action going forward, the significance of COP25, and China's pivotal role in efforts to reverse climate change, what has been done and what more can be done. And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our show in Madrid, where representatives from nearly 200 countries are attending the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as COP25. This year's meeting faces rising global temperatures to as much as 3.9 degrees Celsius, according to the United Nations. With the U.S. officially withdrawing from the Paris Accord, climate action is politically charged. Can world leaders band together without the United States on board? Before we get down to a discussion about this and many other fascinating topics related to climate change, take a look at this backgrounder first.
Time for action. The slogan for this year's UN Climate Summit, from December 2nd to the 13th, delegates gather in Madrid to discuss how all countries can do more to curb rising global temperatures. As the UN chief said in his opening remark on Monday, there was no time and no reason to delay.
Three major reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change each confirm that we are knowingly destroying the very support systems keeping us alive. And indeed, we are. In several regions of the world, coal power plants continue to be planned and built in large numbers. Either we stop this addiction to coal, or all our efforts to tackle climate change will be doomed.
Mr. Guterres said one major goal of COP25 was to work out exactly how to put a price on carbon. Global greenhouse gas emission has continued to rise, yet scientists say emission must start declining well before 2030 to avert severe consequences. A UN Environment Program report published last week says countries have collectively failed to cut emissions, and Earth temperature is on course to rise 3.2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, rather than the 1.5 degree goal set in the Paris Agreement. While warnings about climate change have been around for more than 3 decades, young activists have helped drum up public awareness. Protesters holding signs and banners can be seen outside the venue of the COP25 meeting on Monday, as they have been seen around the world. While Chile had to cancel its hosting duties last minute due to domestic unrest, the country's environment minister is still leading the event. Some 50 heads of states are expected to attend, but eyes will particularly be on the world's largest emitters. As the United States withdraws from the Paris Agreement, which might not happen at all depending on the 2020 U.S. election outcome, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi came to the conference to send a different signal from the White House.
On behalf of the House of Representatives and the Congress of the United States, we're still in it. We're still in it.
COP25 is expected to lay the framework for a new phase of climate action from 2020. Regardless of whether nations can come to a consensus, the science behind global warming remains unanimous.
So how vital is the COP25 agenda? How much more effort does it need to meet climate targets? Let's loop in our panelists. In London, we have Isabel Hilton, CEO and editor of ChinaDialogue.net. In our Beijing studio, Ma Jun, the director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, who's also the founder of the Blue Map application. Last but not least, Zhang Jianyu, the chief representative of the Environmental Defense Fund China program. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program. Shall we expect much about whether this summit will be able to achieve much? Ms. Hilton?
Well, we have to keep moving this process forward. We've had a series of reports in the past year to 18 months which illustrate just how big the gap is, and they've also made very, very clear what the price of failure is. So I think that there is certainly a high level of awareness in the public and to some extent in the leaders who will gather in Madrid. At the same time, we're living through very turbulent times globally, and many important emitters have problems that they're dealing with. But the problem is that if we don't move this process forward, it then gets harder every year. So we shall see. This is really a technical one.
We say that every year.
The big one will be next year.
We say that every year before the conference. But every year, at least most of the years, are not necessarily that satisfactory if you compare the result with the original goal. So,
well,
Mr.
we've had some good years, to be fair.
Okay, yeah, there we go. But is this going to be a good year, Mr. Ma?
Yeah, I think this year...
Did I hear a long sigh?
This year going to be tough, yeah. You know, first, as you mentioned, the global economy is not in a very good shape. You know, many countries are not economically, you know, facing some slowdown. But more important, you know, the past success is somewhat based on a lot of compromise, which means that the past commitment made will not be enough to ensure that we achieve the Paris Agreement, even with all the unconditional commitment all being delivered. So this year, you know, we have to enhance, not just ensure the delivery of the original commitment. We have to enhance that commitment and try to move toward zero carbon discharge by 2050.
Right.
Just think about the challenge of that.
That's a huge challenge. By the way, we have an elephant in the room that we really need to mention. That is, you know, the differences among countries in terms of whether climate change is a priority and whether even climate change is a problem. Mr. Zhang, your organization also originally headquartered in the U.S. What about that?
Yeah, I think you very accurately pointed out. I mean, there's the elephant in the room, or the really important player is going to be missing from Madrid, the COP25. But let's come back to your early comment, which is how vital it is for the COP25. I actually think it's quite vital because it's a really good test for the whether, as a human being, that we have the collective wisdom and the determination to solve a problem that I think is more and more being commonly acknowledged. And yeah, I mean, there's turbulence with regard to the economy. There's all these changes with the host countries, so on and so forth. But if we can still be able to pull it through, even with a minimal degree of success, I think that will hugely encourage us, saying that as a human being, we have that collective wisdom.
It's very interesting you talk about the collective wisdom because, as we mentioned, there is an elephant in the room that we really need to also touch on. So, Ms. Hilton, let's just imagine, if COP25 could be a success, at least to a certain degree, does it mean the international community can really move on, at least on the issue of climate change, without the participation of the United States?
I think it would be extremely important to do that. You know, the United States has been in and out of this process before, and at this point, we just can't afford to wait. You know, Trump won't be president forever, and the rest of the world cannot afford to wait for the United States to get back on track. We have to up the pledges next year at the next COP in 2020. When the Paris Agreement was negotiated and the pledges were laid on the table, we knew that they took us to around 3.8 degrees, and that's been confirmed. We haven't done any better than that. That's better than 5 degrees or 6 degrees, but what we need to do is get down to 1.5, preferably, or 2 degrees. Now, to do that, everybody needs to come back to the table with much, much bigger pledges. We have seen more than 60 countries pledge to be net zero by 2050. Some are talking about 2030, which I think is unlikely. But we are beginning to see a lot of important economies, including the European Union, including Germany, a big industrial economy, have pledged to be net zero by 2050. Right. Now, if that can, accelerate and broaden, then, we're in with a chance.
Would this be an interesting model, Mr. Zhang, that without the U.S. participation, even though Isabel argued it was in and out earlier also, but this is quite serious because it also linked to many other areas of the United States now participating in multilateral framework. So will this be an interesting demonstration of an absence of the U.S. and the world moves on? Mr. Zhang.
I think it will be, but let me also point it out that even the U.S. withdrew from the Paris, but U.S. is still a signatory of the party, which is the UNCCC. So UNCCC is a bigger umbrella agreement, and Paris Agreement itself is just a statewide commitment that various countries made. And I agree with Isabel that things will change. Countries will move on. They will have different opinions. But again, this is really a good test of how, as a human being, we'll be able to handle that.
So you're saying, Mr. Zhang, if I could clarify what you're trying to say here, you're saying, even though the federal level U.S. government are trying to say, oh, we don't want to be part of this, but still they have commitments and responsibilities they should fulfill as a result of a member of the UN system in terms of climate change issue. Is that what you're trying to say?
U.S. is still on the table. I mean, they just withdrew from Paris, and arguably, technically, that withdrawal won't happen until the day after next election. How ironic that could be, right, for the whole world to witness, this really the fiasco that's going on. But we need to really zoom in for the COP25, and one of the really key issues for the COP25 is a big task for the Article 6, which is the build of the global carbon market.
Yes.
And we actually believe that the market itself, that's really the feature of a market mechanism, that the market is not something easily to be started, but it also cannot be easily being deserted even when a certain party wants to leave.
Participatory, transparent process. If, gentlemen, we could come back to our studio and talk about this. China has been active over the past 10 years, shall we say. But the thing is, now geopolitics becoming very complicated. Sorry I mentioned that factor, which is not that pleasant, but it's a reality of life. So how is that likely to impact the real discussion, the core issues, and the definite result this should achieve, Mr. Zhang?
Well, definitely it will play a role. And if we think that climate change itself is so a standalone issue, is so independent from the whatever is going on in the world, I think we're just being naive here, right? I mean, climate change is one important element of the global negotiation, geopolitics. But also, I think we need to recognize, we hope the human being can be really united in front of a crisis. And I think if we fully recognize the crisis,
that's our hope. Is that the reality?
Then we can put our differences on the side and
say,
at least this one issue we need to unite together and to fight with it.
As simple as that?
Yeah, yeah.
Is he living in the ideal world, Mr. Zhang? What about you, or your thoughts, Mr. Ma?
Yeah, I think geopolitics matters. This time with the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement, it basically undermines the global solidarity that we tried so hard to achieve. Without that global solidarity, it will have a huge impact on all the major countries, the signatories of this. And taking China, as an example, now, for all these years, it was the Sino-US agreement, which basically paved the way for Paris Agreement for all these countries to come together. But now, with the leading emitter, basically dominant, one of the major emitters out of this, and inside China, when we face the economic slowdown and all this trade war, there are all those voices, mentioning why should we continue? There are these other priorities. We're facing so many other priorities. So this is very, I think, very, very unhelpful. I hope that things can change. Although in America you also have states and cities which are and companies.
Certainly,
brands.
It's very encouraging, but it's not the same.
No, still not the same, especially when we come to this UN process, intergovernmental process.
Yes, exactly. I want to also ask Isabel about that too. I mean, if you think about that, climate change issue has been a common consensus that has managed to bring many of the big powers, China, U.S. included, together. And it was being considered as a common ground with which they could also develop their relations, whether bilateral or multilateral. So now that factor seems to be compromised. Ms. Hilton, what do you make of the ever more complicated, entangled issues together?
I think we're certainly in a different era, and I don't think that's going to get better in the short term. And I would return to my point that we can't afford to wait. But on the positive side, as Majun has just indicated, states and cities in the United States, which represent 70% of the US GDP, are in a coalition called We Are Still In. They are still committed to the Paris Agreement, and they are still taking action at their levels towards the Paris goals. It represents, again, about 2/3 of the US population. So my feeling in terms of US politics is that Donald Trump doesn't speak for the United States on climate change. And I think that is why I think it will change. Again, in a lot of countries, you're seeing pressure from the street. You're seeing popular movements on climate change, particularly from young people, which are putting pressure on governments. And it is true that because climate change has always been treated as something that can wait until tomorrow, it has had to wait until tomorrow and be knocked off course by short-term crises. The same was true before Copenhagen. We had the financial crisis, and there is always a crisis. And actually, as climate change impacts hit, there always will be a crisis. But the lesson that we ought to draw from that is that we need faster action rather than postponing action, because this will only get worse. This is always our best moment for climate action.
We are, of course, going to talk about who are the leading players in terms of pushing the agenda forward for this year, at least the COP25, but right after this break. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. China's pivotal role in efforts to reverse climate change. What has been done and what more can be done? That's up for discussion after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. It was 4 years ago when the United States and China pledged to lead the fight against climate change at the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris. But what a difference the past 4 years make. U.S. President Donald Trump has officially pulled out of the Paris Accord, while China has kept its commitment with or without the United States, as many believe. As the most populous and largest developing country in the world, China has pledged to cut carbon emissions by 60 to 65% by the year 2030. China pressed ahead with a nationwide carbon emission trading system 2 years ago, the world's largest carbon trading market. With China living up to its words, many experts say the country is now on the track to meet climate change goals 9 years early. So how vital this time is China's role in the climate efforts worldwide? What has been done and what more to be done? We're still having Isabel Hilton with us, and also in our Beijing studio, Wu Changhua, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Beijing Innovation Center, and as well as Ma Jun and Zhang Jianyu staying with us for this round of discussion as well. Changhua, I would like to speak first. China's goal, 60 to 65%, that's a huge goal. If you look at the year, it's not that far, in fact. Time flies. Is there a possibility to achieve it?
I have full confidence in China honoring its commitment, because 60 to 65% is the intensity target. There's the other side of the commitment is China is to achieve peaking of its emissions by 2030 as well. So the two coming together, I think China, it's not an easy target, but I believe China is right on the track, continue to honor its commitment through improving energy efficiency and install as much renewable energy as possible. In the meantime, really transforming the energy market as well as the industrial structure as well.
Now, there are a lot of terminologies in our discussion. Mr. Ma, I have to beg you to help us to understand better about this. You know, what about the 60 to 65%? What does that really mean? You know, the peaking that Changhua was talking about, what exactly and how do they work together? Why is China a pioneer as a result of this, Mr. Ma?
the intensity target means that our efficiency, our energy and carbon efficiency will be much more enhanced. We used to be inefficient, but from the year 2005 and especially after 2013, China continued to work on local pollution control, and in the meantime, this co-benefit is helping on the climate side. So our efficiency is now, compared to 2005, our per unit GDP carbon intensity have been reduced already by 45%. That is more than 55 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, close to 1 year of the global total emissions. So
that was the number of last year, global total CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, 55.3 billion tons total.
Okay,
so it's
China,
huge,
China did its part.
So so this is a huge contribution already made in China, and on the peaking side, I think this means that China committed that we would try to peak before 2030 and try to be ahead of that. So now I think the projection goes that if we continue to try, maybe around 2025, there's a possibility for China to peak. It means that after that, China's carbon emission will go up.
I see. It goes down, rather.
Yeah, go down.
Go down.
It means that we're going to bend the curve, which is very, very important, because before that, China's carbon emission used to skyrocket in some way, we should say. Between 2000 and 2011, for example, our coal consumption tripled. Along with that, our carbon footprint have really, really expanded.
Skyrocketed.
So after that, I think, so that's why, the white paper, the government just published a claim that China basically put a halt to the fast, rapid expansion of our carbon emission.
It is not just the record, but also the way to do it. Jianyu, you have been very enthusiastic about carbon trading. Over the years, you talked to me many times about that topic, and now
every time.
many times. And now China is on track. What does that mean for China's economy, which is a developing country?
Well, first start with the carbon market. Carbon market basically is a way to put a price on carbon. So once you have a price on carbon, then you give people incentives to reduce more and reduce earlier, which will serve for everybody's benefit. And I think it's really quite remarkable when China made the pledge back to 2015 that China is going to be the largest carbon market in the world. And as the Council continued with that on December the 19th, 2017, they made a specific pinpoint plan that the largest carbon market will be built and launched by the end of 2020. And I think I'll be very happy to report to you and to our audience that really steadfast progress has been made despite the government reform, despite the U.S. withdrawal, despite the economic turbulence, but it's still the work is going on. We believe that once that carbon market is built, not only it will give the economic incentive for the country to reduce furthermore, but also it's a good way for China to fulfill what we said in the 18th Party Congress report, which is that China on climate change not only not only had to be a contributor, a participant, a contributor, but China also wants to be a torch leader on climate change. I believe building the largest carbon market in the world is the best manifest of being the torch leader on climate change.
But if you think about that, China's a developing country, the size of its economy is gigantic. And therefore, what does that mean if the carbon market is really established? And if China is really looking at the market mechanism, try to reduce its CO2, what does that mean for businesses? What does that mean for organizations and individuals?
Well, for businesses, you have the best tool in the world at your disposal to really give you incentive to factor that in your planning, factor that in your construction, and factor that in your operation.
In other words, it also means if you don't do so, you will pay a lot of money for that.
You'll be penalized. But one other thing I think is much bigger and much more important is once we have a price on carbon, we're going to really have a mechanism to foster decentralized innovation this whole country, the whole world needs to go to every corner of the society. People will look under your table to see if I can do something to reduce my carbon, this is how much I can get.
I'm looking at right now. Is there something I can do right now? But, you know, maybe I can check on the table. But Mr. Ma, Arjun, you've been over the years dedicating to reduce the environmental pollution here in this country, particularly after the devastating smog issue. Now, you established also the Blue Sky Map, which is an application you go on and you try to check who is doing a good job and who is doing a bad job. And you can see it right there every day. So what is your takeaway over the years about, you know, the challenges? And also, what can be done, have already been done?
Yeah, I truly agree with Jianyu that market-based solution is extremely important because for too long, the market run against our environmental protection when the cost of violation continue to be much lower than the cost of compliance. So what we try to do is to tap into the government monitoring and enforcement and get all these records serving the major brands who want to go green, and now investors, banks and investors who want to go green, so that they can use their sourcing power or investment tools as a motivating power to change that low cost of violation, basically. So with the market started coming, on the side of the environmental protection, we as just a nonprofit organization every week now receive more than 100 companies to try to resolve their violations problem, making disclosure.
Well, you can see it interpreted both ways, right? There are a lot of violators, but there are a lot of people that also want to resolve the issue.
But in general, I still think that it's very helpful because in this way, when we face the slowdown of the economy, when the local government, sometimes want to relax the control, they worried about the tension between environmental protection and growth. Now, if we don't have this kind of market ways which can balance the two, then I think not just the climate change action going to suffer. Our whole environmental protection work is now at some risk.
It's not just about market. I think your work also has a lot to do with the administrative power in a way, because local governments and even some of the institutions at the central level are looking at your map on a daily basis and trying to check who are the violators and what can be done, right?
2014, in response to people's demand for clean air and NGOs' application for real-time data, Chinese government have done something remarkable, never happened in any part of the world. Open the real-time disclosure of automatic monitoring data. And what we do is we compile all of this air quality and emission data.
How would you compile the data?
Yeah, just every day, tracking, use our computer system to track 4,600 sources and bring all this data together. Every day, over 1 million pieces of emission data and quality data. And now this data have been presented over our Blue Map app. Yes. And this app can help people visualize. Those who are not in compliance will be in the color red, otherwise in color blue. And many people started tapping into this to pressure those red dots. And one by one, they started coming to solve it.
You were earlier told me about the story that there are some companies that are checking their sourcing.
Yes.
Whether the sourcing companies they're working with are in red or not. If they're in red, they're reluctant to work with them because eventually the market, the consumer is going to be not happy about the product coming from those companies.
Yeah, many brands and investors claim that they want to go green, but now we have a data to build a accountability system. If they have problem, the data chain will show them, will help them.
How a national goal being set and proactive policies coming from central and local governments, it seems, at least for now, would mean for the motivation of innovation. Earlier, Jianyu also talking about incentive as a result of market mechanism. So how does that work? Incentive and real innovation in the environmental protection, climate change issues.
Incentives and disincentives are the most probably crucial element driver for innovation, because there is incentives or disincentives available that create the basic driver for people to invest in innovation, because the innovation have markets And so the innovators know that by developing solutions, developing new technologies, and there is a market demand for the application of the technologies, and through the policy incentives, the disincentives, they'll be able to play their role.
Like what? What kind of innovations? Give us some examples.
Sure, and I think solar and wind are already sort of classic examples there already. In the last decade also, if you look at the solar energy, so the cost of solar energy decreased 90%, and wind 40% already, right? So on the innovation side, of course, there's a long journey in terms of really get the technology together, doing the industrialization of the technologies, policy create the incentives for deployment, and the cost dramatically coming down. But
there's still innovation. What is the innovation that you're looking at?
I'm looking at more and more looking into energy IoT. Look at energy technology, renewable energy, and together with the digital technology there as well.
Sounds fascinating.
And the companies like Trainer Solar and many others already stepping up in.
Yes.
And so supporting them in that process and really create the market, actually. It's fascinating to see the results. And if you look at the battery technology, energy storage, which is another fascinating story happening in China market today.
Wow.
So China's leadership with solar and wind, and now it's energy storage battery technology.
I'm sure Isabel know all of these latest developments while we talk about them. Isabel, you've been following China and also the efforts about climate change here over the decades, I would say. So, your Chinese friends earlier talked so many about the examples and case studies. Your take?
Well, I just wanted to pick up on something Ma Jun said about the cost of pollution, that he did so much to change. Because as China goes into the carbon market, one cautionary lesson from the European experience, which established a carbon market after Kyoto, was that it all depends on the price. And what happened in Europe was that the allowances which were given to companies right at the start of the market were too generous, and the price never got high enough, and still isn't high enough, to drive emissions reductions. Now, in theory, the market is an excellent mechanism because it looks for the most efficient ways to reduce carbon. But if the price is too low, it just doesn't happen. And I very much hope that China, I know China studied the European experience, and we will all be very keen to see that China, took those lessons, that the price really does drive change.
Yes.
On innovation, I think that the big thing, just looking realistically at where we are going to have to use carbon capture in some way, be that carbon air removal, be that finally carbon capture from power plants, which is feasible, but there's a price disincentive. Again, something the market could do something about. But we are just not in a place where we are going to get to where we need to be without some acceleration of carbon removal. And that sets up a whole new set of questions about governance, how you do it, what sort of unintended consequences there might be.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to do. But
a lot
the
to do,
good news
yes,
is
indeed.
that we've had so much technological advance in the last 10 years.
There seems to be a disconnect, at least to me, when we talk about the global realities, which is kind of worrisome and a little bit pessimistic, even some say. And when you look at the vivid examples that are going on right now in China, whether it's about innovation and other things. So how can we make that disconnect connect? That's exactly what we're going to talk about. If you look at the impact of climate change, it's not only inevitable, but it's very more than expected. Already, the past year, as we mentioned, has brought devastating hurricanes, raging wildfires, and crippling heat waves. The World Meteorological Organization declared this past July as the hottest in recorded history. So should that pace continues, the effects could be widespread and catastrophic, according to the United Nations. So what's next after years of climate talks? Who's now the leading climate efforts without the United States, which is a country? So let's come back to our discussion, ladies and gentlemen. Who will be the leading players? Briefly, who are they and why?
Everyone has to be in this together.
Well, you can't say it sounds so diplomatic.
I know.
Every day, every year, people talk about everybody.
But that's what's needed. At this particular moment, the partnership between EU and China becomes very, very critical because of the situation with the U.S. is drifting out of the picture now. So yes, EU, China together, I think that's going to be a very critical piece of the puzzle.
Very interesting. We're going to come back to Isabel later to ask her also to comment about that. Mr. Ma, who will be the leading player? Why?
Yeah, I think, considering the that we got stuck in this, the geopolitics and trade war and social turmoil in many countries, in quite some countries. I think now it's very important for the business to stand out, to stand up and try to take their responsibilities. Many of them made a commitment that they will stick to the Paris deal. But in the meantime, what we have been doing with our partners like CDP, Climate Carbon Disclosure Project, is to develop an index to assess the performance in their supply chain climate action plan. We're
Hold
going
them
to
accountable.
Yeah, we're going to publish the second annual assessment, and what we found is still not very promising. Despite the fact that many of them have 70% or more of their carbon footprint in their supply chain, many of them are not incorporate this into their whole target.
Private sector should still be the leading force, but not yet there. Is that what you're trying to say?
There's a huge potential for them to be there. And now there are all these new tools, as Changhua said, developed to manage that. And so far, unfortunately, they still haven't all been on board. There are leaders, but there are still too many laggers.
Okay. What about Mr. Zhang? What do you think? Leading players, who should they be?
Well, I think there's, without any doubt, the leaders here in the room, China, right? China. I think one of the really remarkable things China has demonstrated to the world is not only by China has taken all the actions, but China is developing something really convincing, particularly to the developing world. There's the OECD countries, except the U.S., they're certainly doing their good things. But China, through this whole industrialization process, be able to prove to the world that China has turned the whole carbon story into a development story. China has converted that into a green development story. In the green path story, Changhua mentioned about, China has become the leader on solar, on wind, and many of the green technologies. And I think other people look at China will see that's the development path that I also want to be in. And I think that's exactly China's, not only to show that, I earlier mentioned about to be a participant, a contributor, but also the torch leader, but also trying to, through its Greening the Belt and Road initiative, really trying to transfer that experience to the other countries and really showing to them that, yes, everybody has to go through this industrialization process. There's nothing wrong for you to get out of poverty. There's nothing wrong for you to get everybody rich. But I'm here to tell you that this is what we have been able to achieve.
I see.
To turn the story from a sort of devastating conflict between the environment, climate, and economic development, but into a sustainable development pathway.
Interesting. Ms. Hilton, I also want to have your final words about who should be and who can be the leading player for COP25 and, of course, on that road ahead, and why?
Any country that has committed to being carbon neutral by 2050, and there are 66 of them, look also at cities like Copenhagen that have committed to be carbon neutral by 2030. These are really outstanding examples. Look at some of the smaller countries like Costa Rica, which has run many months of its year entirely on renewables. And for me, the outstanding climate leader in the last year has been a Swedish schoolgirl, Greta Thunberg, who has galvanized the public mood across Western Europe, at least, and in the United States. And without pressure on politicians, we don't get the kind of level of leadership that we need. So all of these things, I think, are going to be critical.
Yeah. COP25 is once again likely to be a very complicated issue. Whether there is going to be satisfying results for everyone, it is still unknown for this moment. But I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us for this round of discussion. Give us a preview and certainly hope, as we really want to live in hope. Isabel Hilton and also Wu Changhua, Ma Jun, Zhang Zhenyu. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN in your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel, Twitter, Facebook accounts as well. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.